Hello, my name is Tonya Lark. I'm the Director of Family Life Services. Welcome back. This is your final video. We are so grateful for the investment that you will make in helping moms build better futures. In this video, we're going to cover trauma and most importantly, resilience after trauma. You should be in the last section of your manual on the page with the blue box at the top that says trauma. Why do we spend time studying trauma? Primarily because every mom that we serve has experienced significant trauma, and it very much affects how they live and how they view the world. Take a second to look over this symptoms of trauma checklist. In your head, think about how many of these symptoms resonate with you. Just know the moms we serve look over this list and they say yes, yes, that fits, and that fits over and over again. Walking a hard road filled with trauma has long-lasting effects on our bodies and how we perceive the world. Trauma affects how we see things, how we experience things, and how we think about ourselves and our place in the world. But our past is not our future. The last 20 years of neuroscience has confirmed what we as Christians already know. People can heal and they can build resilience. Even one significant, encouraging, healthy relationship reduces the effects of trauma in someone's life. As Christians, we know redemption is at the core of who God is and His desire for His children. Truly, the Spirit moves and hearts and minds transform. Healing occurs. Of anyone, we have reason to never reduce a person to their past or see their future as constricted and without hope. Every mom we serve is made in the image of God and has the glorious capacity to grow and blossom into the person she's meant to be. As mentors, knowledge about trauma and resilience positions us to be successful if we can appreciate how trauma affects our brains and our perception of the world. If we understand this, we'll have a lot more insight and compassion and patience for what can look from the outside, sometimes like poor decisions, impulsivity, immaturity, and an inability to cope with hard things in life. We can also encourage our mentees more effectively and build relationships with them more effectively. So what is trauma? It's a common word these days and seems to get applied to lots of different things. A typical working definition of trauma is a stressful event that causes physical or psychological harm. Some examples include a car accident, a hurricane, war, wildfire, abuse, or neglect. The key is not the event itself, but how the person in the event experienced it. When we talk about trauma, lots of people can experience the same event, but they don't have the same experience of the event. Some folks will go through something and walk away with a hard memory, but it doesn't continue to burden them. Others go through the same event and they really do feel burdened, or it burdens them in some ways for the rest of their lives. So it's important not to judge moms or ourselves with questions like, is this experience hard enough to count as traumatic? Other people have this same thing happen and it doesn't affect them like it does me, so I guess I'm dealing with this incorrectly. Those kinds of thoughts are natural, but they're not very helpful. So to illustrate this point, I'm going to put up a picture, and some of us are going to see one picture and some of us are going to see another picture, okay? So log right then what you see, and then we're going to talk about it. Okay, so some of you, when you look at this picture, are seeing a young woman looking back over her shoulder. Some others of you are seeing an older woman with a white kerchief over her head. Now, we're all looking at the same picture, and yet many of us saw something different than the others. So when we're tempted to compare our experiences to someone else's experiences, especially with regards to trauma, remember this picture and know that how we each experience hard things is really different from anybody else. Okay, let's start with the extreme version of a response to trauma. This is called post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a very specific diagnosis with specific criteria. The quintessential example that maybe we're all familiar with is a combat veteran who becomes triggered by fireworks or a car backfiring and then is suddenly immersed in a combat experience. A sound like gunfire, but that isn't gunfire, triggers him, and at that moment he finds himself reacting as if he's still in a combat situation. So for example, Mike was an Army medic in Korea and had seen a lot of combat back in the States, and over the next 30 years, he experienced flashbacks. He said, "I flinch and startle when a door slams. I'm always scanning the room. If you didn't keep your head down, you were dead. If you weren't vigilant at night, you were dead. If you fell asleep, you were dead. I hate the 4th of July. The fireworks make me jump out of my skin. Even if I know there will be fireworks, I still jump. My heart feels like it will burst out of my chest. I hate it. I can't sleep for a week after." He goes on to talk about sometimes throwing himself to the ground with his hands over his head, feeling his heart rate, becoming sweaty, and not knowing where he is for a bit. So what's going on in Mike's brain that fireworks he knows are coming suddenly make his body react as if he's in combat? Well, according to Dr. Bruce Perry, who wrote the book with Oprah Winfrey called What Happened to You, which is where a lot of our models for today's slideshow will come from, the veteran's brain made a connection, basically a specialized form of memory, between the sounds of gunfire and the need to activate an extreme survival response. These memories are in a part of his brain he can't consciously control. So let's look at what's going on in our brain through a really basic model. Okay, this is a basic model of our brain. So we start at the bottom with our brain stem, then we go to the next level and the next level, and we end at our cortex. And each of these sections of our brain are responsible for certain functions. Starting at the bottom, our brain stem, that controls our temperature regulation, the fact that we breathe, the fact that our heart beats, and then we move all the way up to our cortex, and that's where we have our creativity, our language, our values, our ability to tell time, our ability to think and hope for the future. So input from all of our senses, our vision, our hearing, our touch, our smell, they first come into our brain in the lower part of the triangle in our brainstem. None of our sensory input goes directly to the cortex at the top. Everything first connects to that lower part of the brain. The incoming input from the external world is matched by our brain against previous experiences. Our brain is efficient that way. So if a previous experience activates the stress response, then that stress response will happen. That part of your brain, that lower part of your brain, can't tell time. It can't even really process that it isn't the same event to interrupt that stress response. Eventually, the signals are going to get to the cortex, which can tell time, which can figure out what's really going on in context. But the thing is, the stress response shuts down the higher part of the brain. So the stress response makes it even harder for the information to get to the cortex. So our brain is organized this way to act and feel before we can think. And this is great if you're running from a bear. It keeps us safe in extreme circumstances like being in a combat situation. But in ordinary life, it's not actually that helpful for most of us. Now, PTSD is a complex diagnosis with very specific symptoms. Some folks experience lots of trauma and do not have PTSD. Some folks experience just a bit of trauma and then they have post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, let's review where we've been. We've learned that the range of experiences we've had are going to affect how we think and how we perceive our world. And that varies with each person. Just like with this picture, we each saw something different, even though we all looked at the same picture. We could be utterly convinced that we are perceiving the world accurately, but someone else is looking at the same picture and convinced that what they're seeing is accurate. Now, whether the woman in this picture is young or old, it's not important. But what if your perception of this picture actually meant something important, like whether you're safe or not? Then figuring out whether this picture has an old woman or a young woman is really important. And what we're going to explore next is that whether the woman is old or young, if that's associated with a danger in your past, then one's ability to see either the young woman or the old woman accurately is going to be diminished. Okay, we're going to talk about stress. So we usually think of stress as coming from hard things. But actually, it can come from anything that demands something of us. So it could be a birthday party or a crazy week with sick kids or a promotion at work. So think about that feeling when you're ready for something that's going to demand something of you. Do you know that feeling when you're at your best and you're ready for sort of the next big thing? To me, I think of that feeling as perking up and leaning in. Think about though what that feels like for you. Okay, the feeling when you're anticipating something that is going to demand something of you, how you experience that feeling probably relates to the typical pattern of the stress in your life. So, if your pattern of stress is predictable, moderate, and controllable, if that's the usual pattern of the stress that you've experienced in your life, then stress can lead to growth. It can increase our tolerance for stress, and it can increase our resilience in the face of hard things. But on the other hand, when our pattern of stress over time is unpredictable, extreme, or prolonged, then our bodies and brains become overly reactive or sensitized. So for example, your baby has a wet diaper and cries. The baby is feeling stressed for a moment because she's uncomfortable, but then we pick her up, hold her close, realize her diaper is wet, change it, cuddle and coo for a minute, and all is well. So the baby experienced stress because the diaper was wet. The mom took care of the stress by changing it. Baby feels better. When that kind of pattern of stress happens over and over, then the baby learns that stress comes and stress goes, but the stress doesn't leave the baby feeling unsafe. This happens over and over in our life, and all of those experiences can build up to say, I can feel stress and I'm also okay. I'm safe. So predictable, moderate stress that you control in some way over and over, that produces a feeling in us of being regulated. But unpredictable, extreme, or long periods of stress that don't get controlled or handled, that produces a feeling of being dysregulated. Okay, let's dive deeper to understand what's going on in our brain when we experience stress. So you'll remember this upside down blue triangle, that's the picture of our brain. Remember, the brainstem is at the bottom, the cortex is at the top. And also remember that our input from the outside world, from our five senses, but also our input from our inside world, or our bodies, come in through the brainstem. So these systems that are marked in the middle of this diagram, these are the systems, the connections between our brains and our bodies that process stress. So this is a picture of how we respond to stress in our brains and bodies. The input from the outside world and the input from the inside our bodies comes into the lower brain, the brainstem, and then it must go through our core regulatory networks. These networks are trying to keep everything regulated in our bodies. They're keeping them in balance and in equilibrium. When we're pushed or facing stress, our stress response system in our brain will activate to help us. So what does that look like? Okay, so we have a moment when we feel stress or maybe when we feel afraid. First, we flock. We look to others to see if they are also experiencing stress or fear. If we perceive that they are, next we freeze, and our brain will focus on the potential threat, shutting down unnecessary things like daydreaming or reflecting on the meaning of life. If we still sense danger or stress, we get ready to fight or to flee. Our heart rate goes up to send blood to our muscles, adrenaline and cortisol pumps through our bodies, sugar gets stored in our muscles, our palms sweat, our hearts race. So we're now ready to fight or flee. And again, if a bear is around the corner, great, your body is ready to go, you're focused and you're ready to move. Now, if we can't flee or fight, or if in the past we couldn't flee or fight because we were too little, or we couldn't in some way do that, then there's a final way our body can respond to fear. Our bodies prepare for an injury instead. In that instance, your heart rate goes down, your body releases its internal painkillers, you withdraw into yourself, time can feel slow, and you might even feel like you're floating. Your body does this automatically. So if you're on a tough road and your body is doing this all the time, over and over, it's exhausting. If you had to cope with lots of unpredictable, difficult things when you were a kid, if you were in that left-hand stress response pattern of stress, then your body was going through this process over and over. And if your body's doing this over and over, then over time it goes there more easily, even over small stressors. So if these kinds of reactions are being prompted by even small stressors, then chances are you have an overly reactive stress response. Because your brain is efficient. The more it travels that stress pattern, the more easily it will follow that pattern over and over. Let's look at another picture to help us grasp this concept. This is the window of tolerance. When you're in this window, your feelings are right-sized, you can think clearly and feel emotions at the same time. You could be calm, curious, clear, and confident. If most of the stress in your life has been predictable, moderate, and controllable, that's produced tolerance for stress in you. You're resilient, and you spend a lot of your time in this window of tolerance. But when your core systems of your brain overreact to stress, you move outside the window. In some instances, you can feel overstimulated, unsafe, hypervigilant, panicked, terrified, overwhelmed. Maybe you can't sleep. Or maybe your core systems shut down a bit. If you're under the window, you feel numb, always exhausted, disconnected or disengaged, a bit deadened, depressed. You might sleep too much, or you might have an impulse to eat a lot to feel better. Folks who have survived trauma spend more time outside of the window of tolerance, either above or below. Okay, so here we are back with our picture of the young woman or the old woman. Each of us saw something different. It was the same picture, but what we perceived was different. So if you're in the flock, freeze, flee, flight, float cycle over and over, and your brain goes into that pattern over even small stressors like wheels in the rut of a road, then you're going to feel more scared, feel more like things are a crisis, feel more like the challenges are huge instead of moderate. Or you might feel completely shut down and like the only thing you can do is sleep and sit still. Someone else might look at the exact same situation and feel like, yeah, I can do that. But someone else might look at that same situation and feel like, no, that is way too big for me. Maybe think about this like a wagon going on a road with ruts. We can drive over the part without a rut, but the more the ruts are deep in the road, the easier it is for the wheels to just fall into that same rut. And it takes a lot of energy and intention to get those wheels out of the ruts. We've learned that people who have experienced trauma have super sensitive stress responses, where even moderate stress sends them outside the window of tolerance to a place of internal dysregulation that's represented by those feelings described in the orange circle or the gray band. So we're going to take a look at another picture of what this looks like, of having an overly reactive stress response. So remember this inverted blue triangle. This is our brain processing stress. And the picture on the right is a picture of what it looks like when our brain is processing stress. So that middle line of the leaf, that is the neurotypical line. Okay, so you'll see along that line, a daily challenge, which is on the bottom of that picture, is met with a feeling between calm and alert. A moderate stress is met with a feeling somewhere between feeling alert or alarmed. And then at the very right side of that straight line, a feeling of distress or threat is going to be met with appropriate levels of fear and terror. It is a feeling of regulation. It's internally a feeling of regulation if we are on that neurotypical line of the leaf. A moderate stress activates moderate state of being alert. But if someone has a sensitized stress response, we're on the top of the leaf, okay? You'll see a daily challenge is met with a feeling of fear, or moderate stress is met with a feeling of terror. So regular life is going to feel big, scary, and it's going to be exhausting and painful. Now, feeling dysregulated is really painful and it's really hard. Living on the top line of that leaf is difficult, and we want to seek relief from that. So we're going to look now at some of the ways that we seek relief from that feeling of being dysregulated. When we feel dysregulated, we want some relief from that feeling. So we go to the things that fill our bucket. We can fill it with healthy things that help us feel regulated and get back on the straight line of that middle leaf. Or we can fill it with things that help us feel better in the short term, but don't feel better for the long term. As you'll see on the bucket on the left, healthy relationships most fill our bucket. And then there's some room at the top for other things. So there's healthy relationships and then healthy rhythms of life. And then you can add some other things on the top. But the big chunk of the bucket is then filled with healthy things, healthy relationships and healthy rhythms. But what's happening on the bucket on the right? In that bucket, healthy relationships are a really small portion of what's in our bucket. And so then we're going to fill it with other things. Some of us have found relief of that feeling of being dysregulated by becoming an addict, by using alcohol and drugs, or sweet and salty and fatty foods to fill our bucket in the short term. These are some pictures of ways that people fill their buckets. So compulsive drinking, compulsive eating, compulsive shopping, compulsive exercising, maybe becoming lost in fantasy or feeling like you have to rescue all the time. Some other ways people fill their buckets is maybe by becoming a really driven type A executive person. Maybe feeling like you have to take care of everybody around you, maybe feeling like you have to be a harsh critic to the people around you, or maybe become burdened with people pleasing. We probably likely see ourselves in some of these pictures, and we'll talk more about that when we're together. I want to go through one more picture of these overly active stress responses and what's happening inside of us when we go through them. So remember, the left-hand side is our inverted triangle, the picture of our brain. But then this chart in the middle is, I think, really helpful for understanding what's happening inside of us when we're feeling and going through certain stress responses. So when we're in a calm state, if you go down that chart, you'll see the dominant area of our brain that's working is our cortex. We're able to reflect or be creative. We're able to daydream. We can think abstractly, and our functional IQ in that state is probably somewhere between 100 and 120. If we go to the very far end of that chart, if our state is terror, then we're existing in our brainstem. We're probably in a fight mode. We may also be in a faint mode, depending on if we're activated to the right of the window of tolerance or to the underneath the window of tolerance. Our reactions, the parts, how we're thinking, are just reflexive. We're just in the moment. We're not thinking clearly. We're just doing what our brain is trained to do. And our functional IQ, when we are in that state, is 60 to 80, significantly diminished. So you can see as you go from calm, that state, to alert, to a state of alarm, to a state of fear, to a state of terror, we're in different dominant brain areas. We may be deploying different reactions, such as freezing or fleeing. We might try to avoid or comply or dissociate even. But you'll notice on the bottom our functional IQ and how diminished in each state to the right our functional IQ gets. A helpful picture of this to keep in mind is we can picture this hand as our brain. Right down here where our thumb is our brainstem, and our fingers right here is our cortex, okay? Now, when our brainstem and our cortex are integrated and fully connected, we're in a great state. We're in our window of tolerance. But if we're moving toward that alert state or all the way into the terror state, our cortex has flipped. Sometimes we could think of this as flipping our lid, okay? When our cortex has separated from our brainstem, then we're only thinking in this part of our brain, and we can't access the higher level thinking, the executive function up here, okay? That's what we saw with that diminished functional IQ in that chart, okay? And until our cortex can come back and connect with our brainstem down here, we aren't going to be able to think clearly, okay? Here we are back to our inverted triangle picture of our brain, with the brainstem on the bottom and the cortex at the top. When we're speaking with someone who has experienced trauma, we have to respect how our brains receive and process information. So our brains must regulate, then relate, then they can reason. We cannot go in a different order. So if someone is feeling dysregulated, they first must get to a feeling of regulation. Then they can relate to us as mentors. Then they can be in a place where they can think clearly. But we cannot go in a different order. When we're in a state of being dysregulated, we don't have access to our cortical memories, to our higher level thinking. When we are feeling regulated, we do have increased access to the higher functioning parts of our brains, the more executive function. So again, if someone is feeling dysregulated and we want to talk about something that, like a budget or something that requires a lot of planning and strategic thinking, then we need to respect the way our brain is wired. We need to regulate first, then relate, and then reason. So what does it look like to regulate? Well, that could look like a mindfulness activity. It could look like breathing. It could be a grounding exercise that puts you in the present. It could be taking a walk. What does it look like to relate? Well, deploying reflective listening, like Twyla talked about, using empathy and validation. Those all establish that relational connection. And then at that point, you can engage in helpful discussion. You can reframe something or develop solutions or reflect on choices or dream about the future. But unfortunately, we just can't go in any other order. Our brain simply must regulate, then relate, and then reason. This is the big takeaway. The mountain trek for someone who has experienced trauma is much more steep with much tougher terrain. That's the reality for someone who has experienced trauma. If you haven't experienced trauma in a way that continues to burden you, you're likely to look at the exact same mountain and the exact same path and think, yeah, okay, it's tough, but I can see a way forward and I can do this. And it would be tempting to think someone standing next to you sees the same path and has the same level of confidence. But it's simply not true. The path and the trek is really and truly different for the moms that we serve. And as guides for their epic journey, we want to see the terrain as they see it. So, what counters the effects of trauma? It's resilience. So we're going to turn there now. Neuroscience in the last 3 decades has completely changed our understanding of trauma and how it affects our brain. It's also exploded a new understanding about how our brains heal. It turns out our brains are very flexible for almost all of our life. This is called neuroplasticity. It's a word that basically means we learn and we can keep learning or retraining our brain until we're very old. We used to think that some stuff is just in there and there's nothing we can do about it, but that's not true. Our past is not our destiny. It may be hard work, but every single person can develop resilience in the face of trauma. What is resilience? Well, it's basically the ability to adapt in the face of hard things. We all experience pain and sadness, and resilience is when we face that head on and figure out how to embrace the hard things as part of our journey and then keep going. Every mom and kiddo that we serve is resilient. They've walked incredibly tough roads and they're still on their feet. And every mom and kiddo that we serve can increase their resilience. And a mentor relationship is a big part of that. So what does resilience look like? Having caring and supportive relationships, being able to make realistic plans and then take steps to do them, being confident in your strengths and abilities, being able to solve problems, being able to say how you feel and what you want, being able to manage strong feelings and impulses. All of these things are integrated as you probably have figured out already, into what the mentor-mentee relationship is about. Let's look at some helpful ways to increase resilience as a mentor. First, we can talk about a stressor. Saying it out loud diminishes its power. And then maybe we can find something about that stressor for which we can be grateful. You could name out loud the strengths that you have to show that you have what it takes to meet the challenge. Then you can make a realistic plan to deal with the stressor and then go slay that dragon. Going through a process like this with your mentee can help build resilience in that mom. Another option in the face of a big emotion is to do what's on this circle here. Notice the feeling and then name it. Accept the emotion, perhaps with some kind of phrase like, it's happened before, it's happened now again. And then be curious. What prompted this feeling? Ask maybe, how intense is it on a scale of 1 to 10? How am I feeling this emotion in my body? And then breathe deeply to release it. Another way we can build resilience is by filling our bucket with healthy things and modeling resilient choices. These things might revolve around rigor, routine, and relationships. So rigor like walking, exercise, or breathing, or doing puzzles. Routine might include things like having 8 hours of sleep and having a regular bedtime routine at the same time every night. Relationships might include building skills like validation, an ability to empathize, reflective listening, and filling our bucket with healthy relationships that build us up. We'll talk more about these when we get together. Thanks so much for spending time with this video and learning more about trauma and resilience. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person and applying and practicing what we've learned. See you soon.